Sometimes a decision begins before you know exactly what you're deciding. You just know the path everyone around you seems to be following doesn't feel like yours. That was where I found myself in seminary. I was surrounded by people who were preparing to become pastors, and for many of them, that made complete sense. They seemed clear about what they were there to do and where they were headed. But I couldn't see myself doing that. I couldn't see myself in a pulpit. I saw myself in a classroom. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet. I didn't know what I would teach, where I would study, or how I would even get there. I only knew that something in me was beginning to point in a different direction. And once I started paying attention to that direction, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. Welcome back to another episode of Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and listening into the podcast. I appreciate you and thank you for listening into the podcast and getting us ranked in the top 5% of all podcasts globally, according to Listen Notes. So thank you so much for that. All right. So now in the last episode, I talked about the decision to leave my home in Connecticut and move to Pennsylvania to attend seminary. And at the time, I didn't see myself as a minister. I went to seminary because I wanted a deeper spiritual and intellectual formation. I wanted a stronger understanding of my sense of call and what I believed. So now at this point, I was in my second year of a 3-year program, which was a Master of Divinity program at Lancaster Theological Seminary. And often the shorthand for a Master of Divinity program is called an MDiv. So if you hear me say MDiv, that's what I'm referring to. So I was there and I was enjoying it. I loved learning. I was drawn to the intellectual life of the place, the scholarship, the spiritual conversations, the opportunity to study ideas deeply. And at the same time, I could see that many of my classmates and colleagues were preparing for pastoral ministry. They were going to become pastors. And I remember how clear it felt to me that I was not. The thought of being a pastor felt counter to who I was. I couldn't imagine myself doing it just because it was what people around me were doing, or because it might seem like the expected next step after earning the MDiv degree. I didn't see myself as a pastor. I saw myself as a teacher. So somewhere midway through the MDiv program, I began sensing that my calling was to teach. I was drawn to teaching others who were navigating their own sense of calling, vocation, and purpose. And once I recognized that, I had a very practical question to ask myself. Now, how do I prepare to do that? Everyone around me seemed to know how to prepare to become a pastor, but I wanted to know how someone prepared to teach in the seminary because that's what I thought I wanted to do at the time. So I started asking. I talked to professors, I talked to the dean, and the answer was consistent. If you want to teach at that level, you need a PhD. That was new information for me. I didn't come into the master's program with the plan to earn a PhD, and I had not mapped out an academic career. I was simply trying to follow this growing sense that teaching was the direction I was supposed to move toward. And at some point, another student and I went together to meet with one of the more respected professors in our program. This student, my colleague, he and I were the only two people that I knew that we were not convinced that we were called to become a pastor. So we both went together to talk to this professor so we could learn more about pursuing PhD programs. The professor was well-meaning, and at the same time, he was very clear about how difficult the path would be. He told us that it would be hard to get into a PhD program. You needed to have a 4.0 grade average. He talked about the competitive nature and all the challenges of pursuing that kind of academic path. I don't remember every detail of what he said, but I do remember what happened after we walked out of his office. My colleague and classmate said, "Well, I'm not going to do it." And I said to him, "I am." I had made a decision. I was going to apply to PhD programs. There was only one problem. One problem. I had no idea how to do that. I didn't know what the topic was that I wanted to study. I didn't know which schools I should consider. I didn't understand how the whole process worked. So I started with one question. What do I want? And one answer came to me clearly. I want to study with or about African American women. I mean, after all, I am an African American woman. But at that point, I had not had the opportunity to study African American women in any meaningful way. So I went to the only African American woman who was teaching in my MDiv program at the time, and I had a conversation with her. I told her I was sensing this call to teach, and I was thinking about transferring into another MDiv program and eventually pursuing my PhD. I also told her I thought I might want to study theology, although even that was not completely clear to me. I just felt like I had to say something that was in the realm of MDiv studies. So she told me about a prominent African American woman theologian who happened to be teaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I had not heard of Union Seminary at that time, but now I had a name. So I started looking into it. I found information and began learning about Union. And something about it began to feel right to me. I still had questions. I still had not applied, but the possibility stayed with me. So now during that time, I went back to Connecticut, my hometown, for a weekend. The minister from the church I grew up in was being honored for a significant anniversary at the church. I don't remember the exact anniversary now, but there was a really big special celebration, and I wanted to be there. So I took the train from Pennsylvania to Connecticut to attend the event. While I was waiting for the train, I was browsing through a small book stand, and one book in particular caught my attention. So I picked it up and opened it. The author was an African American woman, and as I began reading about her experience, she talked about how her journey had led her to Union Theological Seminary in New York. Unbelievable, I thought. I was thinking, oh my goodness. I had just started considering Union, and now I randomly pick up this book and found myself reading about another African American woman whose path had taken her there. And I thought to myself, this is the one for me. But I was on my way to Connecticut, so I continued on, attended the anniversary event for my minister, and then returned to Pennsylvania. But the idea of union stayed with me. A couple of weeks passed, a couple more weeks passed, and I was still thinking about transferring, but I had not applied. I talked with the dean in my program, my current program there in Lancaster, and told him I was considering transferring to Union. His response was that sometimes students go through this kind of struggling and thinking about change in their second year of the program. And he described it as something that could be a part of the developmental process. But I told him, no, no, I feel like this is really a calling for me. And he told me that he was convinced that I could get admitted as a transfer student into any master's degree program in the country. That encouraged me because he was a highly respectable dean and person. So his words about that really encouraged me. And, I was not yet applying directly to a PhD program. I was still in my second year of the MDiv program, which was it was a 3-year program. But my thinking at the time was maybe I should transfer into another MDiv program at a school that also had a PhD program, and that way I can finish my degree, my master's degree, and learn more about how the PhD process worked. Union had an MDiv program and it had a PhD program. And on top of all that, it had that prominent African American theologian teaching there. Those were the things sitting in the back of my mind as I continued to think about the decision. Around that same time, I had begun attending a local church there in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with some close friends. So one day, a couple of my friends were going to visit another church in the area for a special event. It was a diverse congregation, and there was a visiting speaker that my friends hadn't heard or they hadn't experienced before, so they wanted to go. And I didn't know anything about this speaker either. So they asked me if I wanted to go, and I said, yes, I'll go. So now we're in the service, and toward the end of the service, the minister invited people to come forward for prayer. And so there was a long line in the middle of the two rows. The middle aisle was just a long line. And my friends got in the line, but I did not. I was just sitting in the back. And I remember feeling that I didn't really have any questions on my mind. So I felt like everything was okay. So I just stayed in my seat. Eventually, the line got down to only about two or three people. And since I was already there, I thought, okay, well, let me get in line. And, I noticed something different at that church. The minister would pray for the person and then speak to them. And as he prayed and spoke to them, there was an assistant standing next to him with a recorder. And the assistant would give the person the recording to take with them. And so this was before the digital age. So they used mini cassette recorders. And it had a little mini cassette on which they recorded the message, and then they would give the person the cassette. So when it was my turn, the minister, again, whom I nor my friends there had ever met before, gave me a message. After the prayer, he said, you're considering a move, and God is telling you that the move is right for you. And he said, when you get there, pray for the people. I mean, he said some other things too, but the moment I heard him talk about the move, Union Theological Seminary came immediately to my mind. I took the recording home and I listened to it. I thought about it for a while, prayed about it, and decided I would transfer to Union. I began planning my transfer, but it was no guarantee. I still had to apply and then be accepted into their program. But despite that, I started telling everybody, yeah, I'm going to Union, even though I had not actually been accepted to the program, but I was convinced I was going. So I applied. And 6 weeks or so later, I was accepted into the Master of Divinity program at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And I made the move. All right, so now let's talk about the decision. When I look back, I realized that the decision was not simply whether to transfer from one school to another or from one master's degree program to another. The deeper decision was whether I was willing to take seriously what I was beginning to sense about myself. I was in a program where the most visible path around me was pastoral ministry, and I respected that. And I was surrounded by people who felt called to it, but I did not. The decision in front of me was whether I would stay on the path that was easiest to explain from where I already was, or begin moving toward a path I did not yet fully understand. And I really didn't understand it. I knew I wanted to teach, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to teach. I knew I needed a PhD, but I didn't know how PhD programs work. I knew I was interested in studying African American women, but I didn't have a fully developed academic plan. I did have a direction, and that was about it. And there had been reasons I could have decided not to pursue it. I mean, after all, a respected professor had explained how difficult the academic road could be. My colleague heard the same information I heard and decided the path was not for him. And that was a perfectly reasonable response to what we had been told. My response was different. I left that meeting thinking, I'm going to do it. I mean, I didn't know how the whole thing would unfold. I simply knew that teaching felt true to me and becoming a pastor did not. And I was willing to begin moving in that direction. So I decided to transfer. I left Lancaster Seminary before completing the MDiv program there and transferred into Union Seminary's MDiv program. At the time, I was making the best decision I could based on what I knew, what I was noticing, and the direction I believed I was being called toward. And now this is what I understand now. Looking back, one of the things that stands out to me is how little the whole picture I could see. I couldn't see the whole picture. I only saw a little bit. I didn't have some grand vision of my future life. I didn't know exactly where teaching would take me. I didn't know what my eventual body of work would become. I was responding to the few things I knew at the time. I knew I didn't see myself as a pastor. I knew I saw myself as a teacher. And I knew that if teaching was the work I wanted to prepare for, then I needed to begin taking the steps in that direction. What I understand now is that sometimes clarity is enough to show you a direction before it is enough to show you an entire destination. I think many of us make clarity harder than it needs to be because we believe we're supposed to know how everything will work out before we take a step. I certainly did not. I was asking basic questions. What kind of program do I need? What should I study? Where should I go? Who should I study with? But underneath all those questions was one thing I had begun to recognize. I saw myself as a teacher. I wouldn't have had the language that I use now back then. I wouldn't have had the language identity and alignment. I wouldn't have had described my decision as an identity first career decision, but that's what it was. And looking back, I can see that something very important was happening. I was recognizing a distinction between a role I could possibly perform and work that felt connected to who I actually was. I probably could have prepared for pastoral ministry, but being able to do something and recognizing it as your path are not necessarily the same thing. And that distinction matters to me now because so much of my work today centers on helping women pay attention to who they are when they're making important career decisions. At that point in my life, I didn't have a framework for doing that. I just knew that one direction felt wrong for me and another kept drawing my attention. So I kept asking questions. I talked to people. I gathered information. I noticed what stood out to me. And eventually, I made a move toward the direction that was calling me. I also see something now about the role of self trust in that decision. When the esteemed professor told us how difficult it would be to pursue a PhD program, I heard him. I was not dismissing the difficulty. I was not pretending that getting a PhD would be easy. But the difficulty of the path did not change the fact that I believed the path was mine to pursue. That's an important distinction. Sometimes information is meant to help us prepare, but we can mistake it for a reason to stop. I heard the road would be difficult, and my response was still, I'm going to do it. Not because I knew I would succeed at every step, certainly not. Not because I had evidence that the entire journey would work out exactly as I hoped, but because the challenge of the path did not make the direction feel less true for me. Okay, so what might this mean for you? You may be at a career crossroads right now where you don't have a complete answer. Maybe you know more about what does not fit for you than you know about what comes next. Maybe there's a kind of work you keep thinking about, but you don't know exactly how you would get there. Maybe everyone around you seems to understand the path you're on, while you are quietly questioning whether it's really yours to do. Or maybe the next direction you are considering feels difficult or feels competitive, uncertain, or just hard to explain. I think one of the hardest things about a career crossroads is that we often expect ourselves to have more information than is realistically available. We want to know the destination, the timeline, the cost, the outcome, and whether the decision will prove to be right. But sometimes the most useful question is smaller than all of that. What do I know right now? Not what can I predict, not what can I guarantee. What do I actually know? At that point in my life and career, I knew that I did not see myself as a pastor. I knew that I was drawn to teaching. I knew that I wanted to study in ways I had not studied before. And I knew I needed to begin preparing myself for the work I believed I was called to do. That was not the whole plan, but it was enough to take the next step. So perhaps the question for you is not, can I see exactly where this will lead? No, that's not the question. Perhaps the question is, what is becoming clear enough that I can no longer pretend I do not see? Now, you don't have to make the decision I made. You don't have to leave your job or transfer to another school or make a dramatic move. The point is not the size of the action. The point is whether you are willing to pay attention to what you're beginning to recognize about yourself. Sometimes the first sign of clarity is simply the ability to say, this may be good work, but it is not my work to do. Or, I don't know everything about where I'm going, but I know something about the direction I need to explore. That kind of clarity may feel incomplete, but incomplete does not mean useless. Sometimes it is exactly where the next decision begins. When I look back across the decisions I've been sharing in this podcast episode series, I can see how each gave me another piece of information about myself. Leaving the bank taught me something, becoming a social worker taught me something, realizing that meaningful work without passion was not enough taught me something. Leaving my home, my beloved home in Connecticut, and going to seminary taught me something. And now, recognizing that I was called to teach and deciding to move toward that calling added another piece. I mean, I couldn't see the whole pattern then. I was simply living my life and making one decision at a time. And that's one reason I wanted to share these stories with you in this way, because when you're in the middle of your life, the meaning of a decision is not always obvious. Sometimes all you know is that something no longer fits. Sometimes you recognize a direction before you understand where it leads. And sometimes the next step begins with taking seriously one thing you know about yourself. All right. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What are you beginning to recognize about yourself that deserves to be taken seriously in your next decision? You may not be able to see the whole path. I could not either. But sometimes recognizing a direction is enough to begin. Okay, I'm so glad you're listening to this podcast episode, and I'd love to hear from you. Message me on LinkedIn, or if you just want more information like this, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Robin L. Owens, PhD. at Robin L. Owens, PhD. And until next time, this is Dr. Robin